Pizzicato is something that, as an old teacher of mine once said, people don't actually seem to practice, and it made me realize that I've basically been taking it for granted. It was a skill that I never really thought much about. But under the surface of these little plucks lies quite a bit of complexity. So let's dive in and figure out how to work towards the perfect pizz. But first, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Cello Ben, and I've been a cellist for coming up on 20 years now. And for the last 3 seasons, I've been Associate Principal Cello of the Jacksonville Symphony, and I have a busy freelance and teaching career outside of that in both of my home bases of Jacksonville and the Chicago area. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, because I want to leverage some of the experiences that I've had as a veteran of the professional cello world to dive into some topics that maybe you haven't thought about, but that you should. And pizzicato is a big one of those. Now, I'll admit, I've probably done things like this before. Alright, see you at rehearsal. Alright, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is there's a lot to think about, and there are plenty of techniques that we as cellists should develop to get the most out of pizzicato. So let's go to the instrument and talk about how we can up our pizz game. First things first, we need to address where we want to pluck in the first place. The general rule of thumb, get it, is that we should go towards the bridge for less resonance and more power, and towards the fingerboard to up the resonance and have a gentler pizz. So we could do this. Or we could do this. When you're down towards the bridge, it's this stark, tangy sound, and then up here it's nice and round and gentle. So when you're deciding what to do with whatever dynamics are written in the music, keep that in mind. Now, what about your fingers themselves? I generally pizz with my index finger, and my thumb serves to... Why did I use my left hand to demonstrate that when I'm doing a right-hand video? It is what it is. So my thumb serves to keep me anchored on the side of the fingerboard, and that's about all I need to do to get a stable setup, where I can just easily move between strings with just the tiniest of finger motions. Sometimes, though, an upward pizz will really help to intensify something loud and biting. And to do that, I move away from the index finger and go to my thumb. But this is a pretty rare thing for me to do. But when I do it, I put the pad of my thumb on the side of the string and go up from there. Now, speaking of pad, we didn't talk yet about what part of the finger to use. In general, the more resonant we want the pizz to be, the more of the pad of the finger we want to use. Surface area and softness are our friends here. But if we want something stronger and less resonant, bringing a little bit of the nail into the equation can make for an exciting sound. So this is already setting us up with a good baseline for practicing a pizzicato passage. But oftentimes we're not playing alone. So how can we make sure that it sounds unified instead of just sounding like a bunch of popcorn? One critical strategy to develop in ensemble playing is listening to what's going on around you and working to fit in. And this is great for things like sound blending, and it can be a very helpful guidepost for being together with your colleagues. But when things require particularly immediate attention and laser precision, you cannot just rely on your ears. Let me explain. A pizzicato is a fleeting moment. There's no sustain, there's just an attack and then some amount of decay while the note is resonating. So there isn't any margin for error. So keep the old peepers open and clued in on your section leader. Wait for their hand to move, and only then should you pluck. One of my colleagues has a great trick that I often adopt where she begins sliding her hand down the fingerboard when a pizz is coming, and she just gently releases it when it's time, like this. But even if you don't do it that way, staying close to home base, that is right near the string, is critically important. That goes for the bow too in ensemble playing, at least more often than not. But most importantly, don't be early. Don't be truly late either, but it's much better for a pizz to sound a millisecond after the section leader has placed it than a millisecond before. If you're the tiniest of tiny moments late, it'll still sound cohesive, but if it's early, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. Pizz or not, when it comes to ensemble, make sure that in many cases you rely on your eyes before your ears. They're both valuable, but they serve different purposes at different times. And if you'd like to see a comprehensive video on how to make sure you're in the right place when you're playing in the orchestra, let me know in the comments below. But what if you are the section leader? Cueing a good pizzicato can feel quite frightening, and it took me a while to learn how to do it properly. You want to include 3 things in your cue: a breath, a gentle nod, and a little right elbow movement. These attributes, when placed properly, will give a set of trajectories that your section can follow. If applicable, keep your eyes on other sections who are going to be pizzing in the same place and work to cue at the same time as those section leaders. And of course, don't ignore the conductor. The other really important thing about cueing a pizz especially is don't get cocky. That is, don't assume you know where a pizz is coming too early in the game. Let's look at an example from the Dvorak cello concerto. The job of the principal is to properly gauge, based upon the information coming from the conductor and the soloist, where to place a lovely arpeggio. Take a look at what happens if I make the assumption that I know where the pizz will be too early. But if I wait until I'm completely confident about what Maestro Ben and Soloist Ben are doing, it works just fine. I'm doing the 3 things I need to: breathing, nodding, and arm moving. Everything is relaxed, gentle, and in the character of the music, and the section is getting the info that they need. Now in the example I just gave, I didn't just pluck a note, rather I did an arpeggio. So let's talk about how to deal with chords when we're in pizzicato land. The first thing is not every plucked chord should be arpeggiated. Some should, and if there's no indication, take the character of the music as a starting point for which way to go. But let's first deal with the case of not arpeggiating. Either you're doing divisi in the section, in which case you might just pizz one note like normal, or maybe you're playing a block chord. We'll focus on that second example though. If you see a bracket by a chord in the music, it's generally safe to interpret that as the composer not wanting an arpeggio. And for that, we bust out the old claw. To pluck multiple notes at once without separating them, just gently grab all of the strings that you need with various fingers, pull up with whatever vigor is indicated by the dynamic, and release. So for example, now if we do want to arpeggiate, we of course need to find out what should actually be on the beat. Sometimes it's desirable for an arpeggio to start at the beginning of the beat, but other times we want to arrive at the top on the beat. So, now this is a question for the conductor if applicable, and the actual implementation of this is just a question of where you place the beginning. Let's visit 2 versions of that Dvorak from earlier. Now in the music, after this chord, there are 2 quarter rests. And of course, the best thing to do during those rests is to pluck the like, subscribe, and bell buttons below this video. And don't worry, you'll still have enough time to get set for the next measure, as long as you're quick about it. But let's put the question of before or after the beat to the side by now, because there's some actual cello technique to talk about. Namely, we need to adjust how we approach an arpeggio based upon how quick we want the succession of notes to be. Maybe we want this. Or maybe we want this. Now the slower you want it, the more you'll need to finesse things. If it's super fast, just whip your finger across. But regardless of the speed, try starting in the middle of the fingerboard and going diagonally down towards the bridge as you arpeggiate upwards, so that you can let the sound blossom like this. Now, sometimes you may not want to go upwards. A standard arpeggio line can safely be assumed to go up, as can an arpeggio line with an up arrow on the top of it. But if there's a down arrow, we want to go the opposite direction. Keep the angle similar to that of the upward arpeggiated chords, because the lower strings ring better further up the fingerboard. So starting further down, going diagonally upwards like this. When I'm going up, I like to use thumb and then index finger for the other way, but that is your call. Regardless though, whichever direction we're going, we need to be able to control an arpeggiated chord at any speed. The faster ones are easier actually because we go across without really having to pace things too much. And if it's super slow, it's not too bad either, because at a certain point you'll just pluck notes individually. Where we encounter more difficulty is in between those two speeds. And that's because we're in an awkward position where it's too slow to just do a vigorous strum, but too fast to really deal with each note on its own. And to help us with this, we turn to our right forearm. We need to gauge how much momentum we'll need to bring to the table from the large muscle here, and find the sweet spot that lets us do the arpeggio almost automatically at a slower speed. The way I like to think about this is like a music box. And in a way, a music box is basically just an automated Pizz machine. The drum rotates at this consistent speed and it plucks the comb's teeth when it gets there. So for a medium speed arpeggio, bring the arm in at a nice steady pace and let it be the provider of momentum and energy. And it can help to feel a little bit of the resistance from the strings in your thumb as you go up. You'll probably need to experiment with this a little bit, but it is worth the effort. Now, what if we need to Pizz with the left hand? This is a bit tricky when we're already using it with a finger. And if that's the case, the key is to come from underneath the string to the best of your ability. It's almost certainly not going to be as strong in tone as if it came from the right hand, but that's just an unfortunate fact of life. But getting as much leverage as you can will definitely help you in the making of a stronger Pizz. Speaking of the left hand, what's its general role here? Well, same as always. Go in the right place so the notes are in tune. But as I alluded to in a short I posted a while back, tuning with Pizz is a little different than if you have a long sustained line. And that's because the decay begins instantly. A note that would sound in tune when held with the bow will actually sound a bit flat when plucked in my experience, because we don't have that consistency that we get from the bow. So for a pizzicato and very short arco playing, try going a little bit on the higher side if you're having intonation problems. It's not going to be a magic fix for everything, but it can be a good starting place in your problem-solving journey. So let's turn our attention now to a couple of fun variations to pizzicato that are encountered from time to time. One is the so-called Bartók Pizz, also known as snap Pizz. This has a reputation of being very loud and violent, and it usually is. But I thought it would be good to point out a couple of things. First, it's not always super loud. The main thing that separates it from any other Pizz is that it's vertical instead of horizontal. I've played music before that has called for soft Bartók Pizzes. Now with regular Pizzes, how loud or soft it sounds is determined in part by the amount of horizontal momentum we apply. But with a Bartók Pizz, it's more about altitude. So if you want it loud, bring the string up higher, and if you want it soft, only bring it up a little bit. But regardless of what the dynamic is, be very careful and be in control. If you look here, you'll see a very, very sad picture. This was my poor C string back in 2016. I got overexcited for a snap Pizz in a Baird piece, and this picture is worth 1,000 words. By the way, that picture is from Instagram, where you should feel free to give a follow. I try to mix things up with a healthy balance of cello tips, memes, snippets of music, and dog pictures. So it is a good time, at least I like to think so. Anyway, point is, make sure that you're not doing anything impulsive or too quickly. Get your string set between your fingers, pull it up completely vertically, and then release when it's time for the Pizz to sound. Don't ever go too far where it feels like you're really stretching the string out, and don't be too forceful when you pull or release it. These are the kinds of things that up the risk of having something like what I showed you in that picture happen. Now the other thing that gets dicey with Bartók Pizzes is doing them with others. They're notoriously tricky to do in unison with an ensemble. Now, of course, one thing that will help will be for somebody to cue the actual release of the string as opposed to the pulling up, but it's not 100% foolproof. One way around this, depending on the circumstances, is to have the lowest voice of the ensemble play the Bartók Pizz, and to have everyone else do a regular one, depending on the context, perhaps an especially emphatic regular one. This won't be quite the same, and it's surely not appropriate for all situations, but it was a great recommendation that somebody once gave me in a piece where it was both necessary and worked out just fine, so it's a good thing to keep in your toolbox as a bit of a plan B. Alright, one last Pizz thing, and then I promise I'll let you get back to your day. Sometimes you'll see a slur above some notes with a Pizz indication. This can mean a couple of things, and it's important to take context into consideration. If it's on the slower side, it probably just means to have a cohesive line in the phrasing. And that's usually good practice anyway. Similar to when composers write a slur over multiple bars when we're using the bow. In those cases, the slur is often far too long for us to play the passage without changing bows. Instead, it just serves to indicate cohesion in the phrase. But if it's on the faster side, it may mean that you should pluck the first note of the slurred group, and then put the next note or notes down with the left hand. Something like this. So, something like that, you just have to make sure that you're really activating the fingers of the left hand well. And of course, any slurred pizz will have to just be within one string. If you don't have anybody you can ask about this, use your best judgment, but if it's an orchestra, ask the conductor and/or principal. Otherwise, if possible, ask the composer, or a trusted coach, or me in the comments section below. And speaking of asking me things and me helping you with things, I want to let you know that the Cello Ben studio is open. I'm offering virtual lessons to students all around the world, and the first trial lesson is free. So send me an email, mail@celloben.com, and we'll get it set up. Or if you're preparing to take an audition, you can get in touch to schedule one of my audition marathon coachings. We'll go for up to 3 hours, and we'll just take a super deep dive into everything on your rep list. So with that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And let me know, what do you want to see covered in the next video? All right, take good care, and I'll see you soon.